I will begin, before I get into the details, I will begin with the land acknowledgement, and then I will pass it to my executive director, Eileen Alma, and she will welcome David and Audrey. Let me just put out a small footnote here. The land acknowledgement I'm reading was written by a young student who took a peacebuilding in the 21st century course with me by the name of Emma Dixon from Cape Breton. And I asked her one day to write an land acknowledgement, and she says, I will write it from my heart. And this is what she wrote. Thank you for coming together to share some time and space this morning as we begin to open our mind, hearts, and spirit to the words and ideas and insights we'll be sharing today. It's important that we ground ourselves in the understanding that we are all land. Today, we are gathered here in Mi'kma'ki, here where Nalikit Kulikchik, meaning place where branches are torn off, which means Atigadich. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The Mi'kmaq people have been living in a relation with land since time immemorial, and we think it's important we acknowledge this, not necessarily because many of us are settlers or new to this place, but because we are all nature. And we are often encouraged to forget this. So let us take a moment to think of and thank our relations, like the trees that gives us our next breath, that once stood tall and now lie flat because they are now the floor that all sits at. And the minerals that were required perhaps by fathers, brothers, sisters, even children, because they help bring up the electricity we use. Let's acknowledge the why too, because water is the dear friend to all of us here. It sustains us through the rivers and our beautiful Atlantic Ocean. We are all water, as it makes up approximately 60% of the human body. Let's remember that Mi'kma'ki sustains us, and we are not people here today talking about nature, but we are nature talking about one another. Eileen, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
The mic is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Degafi. Thank you for asking me to share some thoughts. I want to, first of all, say good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everybody who's joining us online as well as in person. If you are in person right now, or even if you're not, if you were in the room, you would immediately have the wonderful smell of Ethiopian coffee, and being somebody related to a person who's Ethiopian, my husband, I can tell you how much I appreciate that smell in the morning. And that's thanks to Degafi that we have that in the office today, and that participants who are with us are able to enjoy that coffee, coming straight from the motherland. I would say, Degafi, straight from the heart. The Horn of Africa. And this morning, we, as we are on Mi'kma'ki, I'm also grateful, as Degafi has expressed, grateful for the lands that we are on, grateful for the work that we do with Indigenous peoples. And that work that we do extends actually around the world. And so when I think about communities in Africa that have welcomed us, that have allowed us to learn from them, and also for us to share our own gifts and assets. I'm always reminded of the privilege that we have at the Coady Institute of working with such amazing people, both far and wide. And Coady Institute, for those that don't know us as well, is an organization that has a history and a legacy of close to 100 years. That 100 years begins with our roots in what was the St. FX Extension Department, and very much focused on work here in Atlantic Canada. drawing from the Antigonish movement, which really supported communities to build on the gifts and the assets they have to secure what they don't. That model of social and economic empowerment or social and economic agency has been one that has been a cornerstone for many around the world in terms of our relationship with communities abroad. And so we continue that work close to 100 years later, both locally and globally, with the goal of always ensuring that we can support communities to be the drivers of their own agendas for social and economic change. So we have that privilege of doing that around the world. And our topic today being Africa, I'm very excited about this and feel that the topic is so timely because that work that we have done in partnership with so many communities and in so many countries on the African continent continues to be a major priority for us moving forward. And yet, at the same time, we are seeing a real shift in what development will look like, what it should look like, and what it will look like because of the decisions of many nation states to shift gears around its priorities, including Canada as a whole. That shift from what has been a focus on development and development praxis, both for its interest base, but also for its intrinsic goals. It's a desire to really to see democracy flourish, to see social change happen, is there, but there's also these bigger competing priorities and conversations that are happening around the need to focus on nation state interests like trade, like security, like our own economic growth. That interest-based approach in what is a multipolar and fragmented world is quite profound. That shift that some of us have believed has been happening for quite some time, but feels all of a sudden so. It's being put in stark relief right now in terms of everything coming to an head. So I can't think of anybody better to lead us in a conversation today than Dr. David Black, who has such a rich level of academic writing, research, reflection, and background, who's a well-known scholar, not just here in Canada, but abroad, and has been for so long. I mean, I remember the days, early days of my own career, and seeing his work from Ottawa, where I was based, and reflecting on the level of expertise that we have here in Canada around this field. So, David, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you into Coady virtually to our network of graduates and partners. I'm seeing some really familiar names online of people joining us, many that I think you know as well. And I'm excited about what we're going to learn from you today and that others are also going to learn. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn back to Degafi so that he can quickly get you started. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. Again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, all of you. Thank you for joining us across these shifting time zones from every corner of the map. Just to orient our global gatherings, it's currently 10:30, a little past 10:30 here in Antigonish. Meanwhile, our friends in Abuja, Nigeria, are navigating hot 33 degrees, and it's 2:45 p.m. in Abuja, while in Paris, some of people joining us is 3:40 p.m. and in Mexico City it's around 8:30 a.m. and in Addis Ababa it's 5 o'clock and 27 degrees. I'm sure you're not trying to be sort of looking for Korea and weather forecast, but I just would like to wander around and see what's happening in this beautiful planet. By design or cosmic alignment, we gather on the eve of today on May 15th, the International Day of Families, a global sanctuary decreed by the United Nations in 1993 to honor the foundational architecture of human society. Yet today, our vision must shatter the narrow boundaries of biology to embrace the vast interconnected tapestry of the global human collective and the fragile non-human lives sharing our spinning world. Assembled under the banner of Canada-Africa relations in time of turmoil, we confront a towering, multi-layered question. How do we anchor the soul and survive chaos at the individual, domestic, communal, and global level? While our immediate kin from the front line of defense against adversity, the sheer staggering magnitude of modern global crisis demands a radical awakening, a coming together of a family far greater than we ever know can define. Now, let me say a few words, and then when I emailed David to send me his bio, he sent me a very short paragraph. And I know David has a long career in this field, and he's being modest. So I'm going to read what he sent me. David Black is the Lester B. Pearson Professor of International Development Studies and the Professor of Political Science at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. He has long-standing research interests concerning Canadian involvement in sub-Saharan Africa, including development, cooperation, human security, and peace operations, the extractive sector, and multilateral diplomacy. Other research interests include post-apartheid South Africa's foreign policy, sport in global politics and development, and disability in global development. His current research focuses including engendering disability-inclusive development, a multi-year social science and humanities research council, a shared partnership project involving collaboration with researchers and disability advocates from several countries, and a collaborative project on middle powers in an era of warring order for men. I am particularly interested in the word ferment, and the dictionary definition of ferment has three contexts. One key aspect of ferment, biological, they undergo or cause to undergo fermentation, often turning carbohydrates into alcohol acid. The second one is physical action. The process often involves foaming, bubbling, or heat generation from the Latin fervere, or to boil. And the cultural one, which is important for us, is a condition of turmoil, turbulence, or intense activity such as in a political ferment. I don't know which one David had in mind when he used the term ferment, but what we will do is listen to David, what he has in mind, and David has about 35, 40 minutes, and then we will open up for Q&A, and I have the privilege and the perks of being a facilitator. I'm going to get a chance to ask him a few questions. David, the mic is yours.
Degafi, thank you so much. And Eileen, thank you so much as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. I wish I was with you in person. Degafi knows that I managed to rupture my tendon a few weeks ago, and so I'm less mobile than I would usually be. But it's a delight to be with you. I was struck by your choice of the term turmoil, Degafi, for the title. There are so many synonyms for the condition that we're living through. Turmoil, ferment, rupture, interregnum is another idea, but we are clearly in a period of dynamism, of uncertainty, of insecurity, and the question is, how will this unfold, and what role will Canada and Africa play in that context? I did want to say thank you for your land acknowledgement, Degafi. That was very moving, and it underscores the degree to which one of the elements of this relationship that was underappreciated for a long time was the colonial dynamics that exist between Canada and Africa, and Canada as a colonizing state, and how that affects the ways in which we have engaged with African partners. To a large degree, we've benefited from being seen as a non-imperial partner in much of Africa, and we managed to occlude in our own imaginations what it meant or the fact that we had a colonial heritage of our own. And so that's something that I think we're beginning to grapple with in the current moment. So what I want to do is three things. First of all, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about where we are today in terms of the relationship between Canada and Africa, broadly conceived, and then spend a little bit of time looking backwards at how we got to this place, and a history of what I call in my own work the consistent inconsistency of Canadian engagement with sub-Saharan Africa, and I do that because I think it's important to look back and understand this history, but also because that history illustrates some of the conditions that have led to periods of intense engagement with African issues, and some of the dimensions of the relationship that have led to the forgetting of those connections, or the lack of continuity, the lack of sustainment in the way we've engaged with African issues. And then I want to ask if we are, in fact, at a turning point, and how the current conditions of turmoil abroad and at home could lead to a more sustainable, and strategic relationship between Canada and Africa. And I do this partly with the recently released, or relatively recently released, Africa Strategy, Canada's Africa Strategy, which was released in March of 2025, so just over a year ago, and ask whether it could become the foundation upon which a more sustainable, and comprehensive relationship could be built. Okay. So where have we been? And in short, over the past 20 years, Africa has drifted towards the margins of official Canadian interests and priorities. That does not mean that there have not been vital links between Canada and African partners, and I think the Coady Institute is a really important manifestation of those ties. Among other things, until last year, Africa had consistently been the largest recipient of development cooperation spending, or foreign aid spending. Last year, not insignificantly, it was supplanted in that role by Europe, which means principally Ukraine. And that tells you something along the lines of what Eileen was referring to earlier about the ways in which international relations and Canadian foreign policy are evolving. It was also became an important focus under the development umbrella for initiatives related to maternal newborn child health and to sexual and reproductive health and rights. So there have been specific thematic priorities, especially related to feminist issues, that have risen to the fore in the last decade or so. And there are, as exemplified by the Coady Institute, longstanding transsocietal links amongst civil society organizations, but increasingly and very importantly, a growing diaspora community and representative groups in Canada. There is, of course, the important and often controversial role of the Canadian extractive sector and Canadian mining companies in various parts of Africa, and growing, though still relatively modest, trade and investment relations. And that's a significant issue in a time at which we are heavily preoccupied in this country and elsewhere with material opportunities in international relations. Nevertheless, there are some markers of drift, or markers of marginalization, mutual marginalization, I would say, between Canadian and African partners. One measure of this is that a theme that has been an important element of Canadian international relations, especially in Africa, is Canadian participation in multilateral peace operations, which declined sharply from the mid-2000s and has reached historic lows. Africa is the only continent without an active bilateral free trade agreement between Canada and one of its constituent states. The long-awaited Africa strategy that I'll be talking about a little bit more towards the end of this talk was long-awaited, long delayed, and when it was actually released, was released without precise targets or funding commitments, and in a much almost under cover of darkness by the parliamentary secretaries as opposed to an important minister. So that was symbolically very important. And at the G20 summit in Johannesburg in November, November 2025, Prime Minister Carney explicitly noted that Africa was not an early priority for his government due to limited opportunities for immediate returns. So there is this, and I guess the kind of concluding irony that I want to stress is that this drift towards the margins of Canadian official priorities was taking place at precisely the same time when much of the rest of the world was recognizing the continent's extraordinary economic, political, and strategic importance. And what this means is that we have become marginal to Africans to a large degree. That so that Canada is playing catch up in trying to forge more substantive relationships with the African continent and African partners. So how did we get here? Prior to the last 20 years, and I'll talk about those last 20 years in a minute, there was a long history in the post-decolonization era of periodic, high-level political, media, and societal interest. And I have a list of some of the times and places where Africa rose close to the top of Canadian political priorities, and certainly got a lot of attention. These included John Diefenbaker's role in the expulsion of South Africa from the Commonwealth in 1961. There's a backstory to all of these things that is more complicated than the headline. But nevertheless, that was an important symbolic moment. Canada's growing engagement with Francophone Africa in the early 1970s, the response to the Ethiopian famine in the mid-1980s, the human security agenda of the 1990s. The two that I want to specifically focus on that the pictures reflect was the Mulroney government's very active and sustained engagement with the end game of apartheid in South Africa from the mid-1980s to 1994 and beyond. The other one that I wanted to explicitly mention was the Chrétien government's 2002 role at the G8, which it hosted in promoting the Africa Action Plan as a response to the to African states' new Partnership for Africa's Development. And this was a very important initiative at the time, in part because it was sustained despite the fact that this was the first summit after the 9/11 strikes in the United States. And so the fact that Africa was at the top of the G8 agenda was a significant measure of Canadian prioritization. So how do we explain what we see is instances of episodic engagement? And the question is, how do we explain them? And here's where I think we highlight a number of features of the old order that made these initiatives or these moments of engagement possible, that we need to ask to what degree do these continue to forge a foundation for engaging more actively with Africa. So the first condition was a deep interest in the health of multilateral organizations, in particular the Commonwealth, La Francophonie, the United Nations, and laterally the G7 in 2002, or the G8, because it included Russia at the time. So these Canada's commitment to these multilateral institutions became a strong incentive for engaging with the issues that matter to Africans. It's also clear that the Canadian engagement with Africa was always affected by Western hegemonic considerations. Canada often played the role of the kind of kinder, gentler, ostensibly non-imperial face of Western interests in Africa, and was clearly mindful of and responsive to the interests of larger Western powers like the United States, France, and the UK. These moments of engagement always reflected the priorities of senior political leaders, and there's a list of them that I've got in the slide. But the point was that there was high-level political interest in the issues at stake. And in the case of the anti-apartheid struggle, the role of Brian Mulroney as Prime Minister, Joe Clark as Foreign Minister, Stephen Lewis, who recently passed away as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. In the Africa Action Plan, the role of Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin as his finance minister, and Robert Fowler as his Sherpa and the G8 process. And the point here is that in this earlier era, there were many elements of the Canadian political establishment, who I would describe as Africa affected, either directly or indirectly. They had some personal experience or knew people with personal experiences in the immediate post-decolonization years, and this affected the way that they thought about the importance of Africa. There was also substantial cross-partisan consensus between the two dominant parties, the Liberals and Conservatives, on foreign policy issues, including Africa. And there was always the development of cross-sectoral and cross-agency task teams to enable these kinds of initiatives. So a commitment to a more comprehensive, in the jargon of the human security era, whole of government approach to dealing with Africa or the African issues in question. And there was always a close alignment with African interests and priorities. For example, on the anti-apartheid struggle, for the new states of Francophone Africa, on having a counterweight to French influence, and on the Africa Action Plan, the African Union's new Partnership for Africa's Development. There was also always robust civil society interest, support, and pressure. I don't want to exaggerate this. The constituency for Africa was not large, but it was active and it was engaged. It included institutions like the Coady, but also faith-based communities and more radical solidarity groups who played an important role, and also an important role for what I would describe as an international policy ecosystem, quasi-governmental or in-between institutions around the Canadian government that were really important as bridges to partners in Africa, like the International Development Research Center, the sole remaining institution of this type, but also the North-South Institute, Rights and Democracy, the Pearson Peacekeeping Center. All of these institutions were effectively issue-specific bridges between Canada and other parts of the world, and sources of information and insight to the government, all of whom, with the exception of IDRC, were dismantled in the Harper years between 2006 and 2015. On the other hand, Africa was always viewed, the prioritization of Africa was always met with skepticism from many permanent officials within the international policy establishment, including the Department of Foreign Affairs, trade officers, the Department of National Defense. CETA clearly was different. CETA had a congenital interest in African issues, but CETA was a relatively weak player in the bureaucratic politics of official Ottawa. And also, there was always the problem of a political attention deficit. So if these initiatives relied on the commitment of high-level leaders, those leaders inevitably had their attention drawn back to domestic political issues in the electoral cycle. And the consequence was that these episodes of activism were virtually never sustained. So it led to what I have written about as a policy or a policy orientation of consistent inconsistency on African issues. And as I said at the beginning, I think recalling these lessons is important when thinking about how to work towards a more sustained and sustainable approach to African issues and partners, partly because of the things that we would need to try to reconstitute, partly because of the lessons that they teach us about how these levels of engagement have failed to be sustained. Now, this cycle of episodic engagement that I've described above was effectively broken by the onset of the Harper government between 2006 and 2015. Many of you who lived through this time and would know what some of the repercussions were. The general point is that Stephen Harper himself and the members of his government took a very different view from predecessors of multilateral institutions, of foreign policy priorities, and of African issues in Africa as a policy space specifically. They were skeptical of inclusive multilateralism, especially the institutions surrounding the United Nations. They focused on what they saw as Canada's closest friends and allies, which quite pointedly included Israel. They were skeptical of the usefulness of aid and ultimately merged CETA with foreign affairs, leading to a decade of turmoil within what has become Global Affairs Canada. And they were heavily preoccupied with trade and investment, all of which, in a sense, foreshadowed many of the current trends that Eileen alluded to earlier on. And though it's possible to exaggerate the degree of disinterest in Africa, in that context, the growth of aid to Africa and Africa's role as the largest recipient of Canadian foreign development cooperation was sustained throughout the Harper years. And it was Stephen Harper who launched the Muskoka Initiative on Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health. Nevertheless, there was no mistaking the fact that Africa was effectively downgraded in the Canadian government's international policy priorities, with a clear and explicit tilt towards Latin America. And in fact, Harper was on the record as declaring that Africa was, in effect, a liberal issue that they were going to distance themselves from. And so in that sense, Africa became a source of partisan branding. The disposition of parties towards international relations in general and Africa specifically became a marker of partisan differentiation. And much to the disappointment of many in the development civil society community, although Justin Trudeau, who elected in 2015, declared Canada's back on the international stage, by which they thought there would be a reversion towards a greater engagement with development issues, with multilateral issues, and notwithstanding some important initiatives like the Feminist International Assistance Policy, a very carefully delimited peacekeeping operation in Mali in 2018, 2019. Nevertheless, there was an absence of consistent interest in rebuilding relationships with African partners under the Trudeau government. And one consequence was that both the Harper government and the Trudeau government were defeated in campaigns for elections to non-permanent seats on the UN Security Council, largely, one would say, because this had been something that Canadian governments, since the founding of the United Nations, had done at least once a decade, was to take a rotating turn on the Security Council. These defeats were symbolically very important, and in part what they reflected was the loss of African support. African governments saw the Canadian government as less engaged, less interested, less actively seized of African issues. Okay, so where are we now then? What is the opportunity structure, if you like, of the current moment? And here the question is, how do we make sense of the turmoil that we're living through, and what kinds of opportunities and challenges it presents to Canadian and African partners in this new context? Canada's Africa strategy has been rolled out in a period when the hegemonic liberal international order of the post-decolonization period is in disarray, time of turmoil or rupture, as we've discussed earlier. There are a number of striking changes. This is not news to anybody in the room or online that are key markers of this dynamic. Perhaps first and foremost, the retreat of the United States from the world order it largely underwrote, and a turn towards crude transactionalism in its international relations. For example, trading access or trying to trade access to critical minerals in various parts of Africa for the renewal of a portion of its commitment to health programs in Africa. So this kind of crude transactionalism. The rise of near-peer competitors and other major powers. So as Eileen mentioned, a much more plurilateral international system emerging, notwithstanding the clear superiority in terms of material power resources of the United States and China specifically. A reverse wave on norms of democracy and human rights, combined with the resurgence of authoritarianism and anti-immigrant sentiment that affects governments and regions all over the world, including Africa. And the pivot towards a narrower, a more transactional approach to international relations in general, but specifically including a surge in spending on defense and security. And as Eileen alluded to earlier, foreign aid, as my colleague Stephen Brown recently put it, falling off a cliff, so that the level of spending on official development assistance will fall by 35% in the years 2023 to 2026 on current trends, and much of that development cooperation spending is being increasingly instrumentalized in the sense that it's being harnessed to the pursuit of economic self-interests on the part of both parties in the relationship. So these dynamics, amongst others, have important consequences for both Canada and Africa. So what does Africa want? And what can and should the Canadian government seek from a reformed relationship with the continent? Notwithstanding resilient Pan-Africanism and in some respects resurgent Pan-Africanism, it is of course hazardous to think about Africa as a cohesive whole. And certainly parts of the African Union's Agenda 2063 remain highly aspirational. So there is this gap between rhetoric and reality in Africa as there is in Canada and elsewhere. Nevertheless, I would like to suggest that there's a shift in the underlying spirit of resolve amongst many African governments and citizens, in part because of an appreciation of the unprecedented leverage they enjoy in the context of a world of turmoil. This more fluid, uncertain, competitive dynamic in the international domain does create new opportunities for African organizations, African governments, and African civil society groups. And there is, of course, the extraordinary economic potential of an emerging African continental free trade area, which is a move which is in many ways at odds with the growing protectionism in other parts of the world, most particularly from the United States. but continues to be undermined by ongoing intra-regional rivalries. Nevertheless, the recent ratification by almost all African governments of this free trade area contributes to the perception of Africa having an exceptional economic upside, that growth rates of both population and economies are likely to be more robust in Africa than virtually any other part of the world in the decades to come. So there is this perception of extraordinary opportunity, yet there are also equally exceptional security and humanitarian challenges that remain, which drive continued demand for disaster and humanitarian resilience and response, even as the level of commitment to humanitarian assistance is declining globally, and the level of assistance to refugees and forced migrants as well is declining. More broadly, Africans are no longer interested, if they ever were, in a so-called donor-recipient relationship based on tenuous claims to generosity, but rather they are looking for a more reciprocal kind of relationship in which partnerships are based on mutual benefit. And this is something that the Chinese government has been quite adroit at exploiting and proposing in building its growing network of linkages with African partners. There is, to be sure, a resurgent mood of anti-colonialism in many parts of the continent, especially amongst African youth, and that is, I think, spilling over in these attitudes towards the role of Western donors in Africa. And globally, there is a sense that any new global order that emerges from the current degree of turmoil will require African participation. Africa is no longer a spectator, never was a spectator, but is much less willing to play that role, and will be essential to whatever new elements of an international order emerge from this current period of turmoil. And this was reflected, among other things, in the G20 Leaders Declaration orchestrated by South Africa at the summit it hosted last November, which, in principle at least, achieved much more than one might have expected, precisely because the United States wasn't there. So what about Canadian interests and stakes in Africa? As I've already suggested, the onus here is on the Canadian government to dispel African skepticism towards its professions of renewed interest, as reflected in the Africa strategy. So the Canadian government says it is interested in building a renewed relationship, but African partners will want it to prove it. There is, to be sure, a real risk of short-termism, or friend-shoring, as it's sometimes termed, or was termed by Chrystia Freeland, towards the immediate returns offered by larger and more familiar governments and markets in Europe and Asia. And one marker of this is to think of where our government's leaders, and in particular Prime Minister Mark Carney, have traveled since taking office, as a marker of the places and the relationships that are being prioritized. So there's a concern that this is, and especially when one thinks about the rollout of the Africa strategy that I talked about before, there's a concern that these new professions will be another manifestation of inconsistency. There are some conditions that need to be met if a more comprehensive and sustainable relationship is to be built. First of all, this needs to be understood as a long-term project. That this is something that will not be seen in in electoral cycle terms, it will be seen unfolding in terms of the rise of Africa over an extended period of time. So it's a long-term project. It also is a project that it needs to be based on a broad cross-section of potentialities, or broad cross-section of linkages. Doug Saunders, the columnist for the Globe and Mail, Doug Saunders, talks about the need for polyphonic relationships, multidimensional relationships, so that if some part of the relationship stumbles or is compromised, other parts of the relationship will be carried forward. It requires investment in a knowledgeable cadre of African specialists, drawing on the robust and growing transsocietal links that I talked about earlier, and some measure of reconstitution of this international policy ecosystem that we have lost since the onset of the Harper government. I've already mentioned the need for a polyphonic approach to building relationships. It requires sustained investment in these relationships in terms of both financial resources, but also personnel and bureaucratic structures to forge deeper relationships with the African Union and other regional economic communities, but also a set of emerging African powers as collaborators in efforts to forge a more equitable global order. So insofar as the Canadian government under Mark Carney is talking about the need not just to recognize what is no more, but also to build new sinews of a renewed global order, Canada needs African partners in that process. So can the Africa strategy anchor this process of renewal? As I said earlier, the launch, the conditions under which it was launched, spoke volumes about the relative weighting of African issues versus issues in other parts of the world. Nevertheless, the existence of an Africa strategy has been taken up by an emerging African policy community, which is determined to hold the government to account for the expectations they have generated. And there are at least some early signs that it's leading to a more engaged and robust source of pressure, to which there is some evidence, at least, the government is trying to respond. So we will see at this stage whether these relationships will be built. I would say in closing, sorry, I've talked rather a long time, but I would say in closing that we need to move past this tendency associated with that synoptic, inconsistent approach of the past of thinking of Canada having some sort of moral identity or moral authority in relation to these issues. We need to approach these relationships with deep humility and with a commitment to staying the course around relationships that we initiate to ensure that they achieve their full potential. And I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, David. I knew from the moment we invited you, you're going to give us a very substantial amount of insight and experience and knowledge, and I'm really delighted what you have provided us with. And this is not a one-time reflection. We'll be using your materials and your books to understand what is happening between Canada and the African continent. I picked up a few points you mentioned in your presentation. Just to highlight the language you use repeatedly, the multilateralism, consistent inconsistency, diaspora, immediate return, transactionism, surge in defense spending, instrumentalism, and trans-societal links are the key points I really captured my attention as you were discussing. Because all these things you mentioned are in one way or the other point us into some direction if we want to understand what is happening, where we have been, as you said, and where we are at the moment and where we should go. So with that in mind, I'm going to use my privilege as a facilitator to ask a few questions and then take questions from participants here in person and online. I would like to begin by asking you current affairs. A few days ago, probably still going on, the French President Emmanuel Macron convened a meeting in Nairobi about Africa-France relationship. And that was interpreted by some analysts and observers of African politics. The challenge France is facing in Western Africa and former colonies. Based on that, the French government is trying to conquer new territories in the East and build new relationships. I would like to know what your reflection on that. One. Two, I'm fascinated by the language immediate return as it comes to our government's policy vis-a-vis Africa. Can you a little bit unpack what that means? That is my second question. My last question is, when we talk about Africa often, what comes up is governance. Governance of African states, democracy, human rights, war, so on and so forth, economic policies. Understanding your point you mentioned about anti-colonial sentiment rising in Africa, and the younger generation pushing back, the fact that the West cannot impose its values on us. But some of these values are universal, and we all agree on that. So how do we navigate that landscape of pushing back on colonialism and also asserting that certain values are universal and we need to work on them and build on that?
Okay. Sorry, Degafi, I was a little distracted by my computer issues. France-Africa relations. Second one, sorry, again, what was it?
The second one was immediate return.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But what does that really mean in the context of the current African political, economic, and social? Also, what does it mean to, let's say, this government, first term, probably another second term? What does the future look like in terms of the government's policy for South?
So let me try to deal with each of those in turn. I think it is. I think that much of what we've been seeing, certainly in the Sahel region, is and in much of Francophone Africa, is the final demise of the French Empire. This was a neo-colonial relationship for many decades, and this is being finally reversed. Whether the French can outrun that history and try to launch a new identity in relation to Africa is to my mind doubtful. I think they will continue to be greeted with skepticism, but it does anyway. It raises issues and potentially opportunities for Canadian policy in that context. I'm sorry if I didn't adequately capture that particular question, Degafi, and please feel free to come back to me on it. The issue of immediate returns. So one of the things that I didn't mention amongst the conditions of turmoil are the ways in which these conditions of turmoil are echoed internally in virtually all governments. All governments are feeling tremendous pressure because of the economic issues that are being caused by the behavior of the United States, by issues of environmental uncertainty, by major global conflicts, the conflict in Iran. So every government feels the need to deliver for their electorate. And much of their electorate has become, frankly, more and more insular, more and more inward looking. And so there's huge pressure on the Canadian government and other governments all over Africa as well to deliver immediate returns for their citizens, for their electorate. And so this is not a new problem, right? This is a perennial problem, but it is accompanied by a particular sense of urgency in the current moment. And this, as a result, the Canadian government has so far, Mark Carney has clearly prioritized relationships, partners, both private sector and international, where there's the prospect for big immediate returns. Africa is a long-term project. The returns will be substantial, and I don't mean simply in material terms. I mean in a broader, more comprehensive sense. They will be substantial for those who are prepared to invest time, people, resources to building truly deepened and respectful relationships. And I am not overly optimistic that the current Canadian government is prepared to make those kinds of investments. But I think that they can be built sort of brick by brick if we stay the course in the relationships that we do forge and continue to invest in their expansion. So it's not a big bang, but it will be something that can be built over time. This whole question of the anti-colonial turn, and of course associated with that, the reversal of the anti-coup norm in Africa, which we thought was really a settled norm that African societies and governments had robustly rejected. The idea that coups were a legitimate way of changing governments, and that spurred on by popular pressure has now been shown to be untrue. And I think what you're getting at, Degafi, if I'm not mistaken, is the place of norms of democracy and human rights and social equity, and that we think of as universal, and how in this resurgence of authoritarianism that exploits these anti-colonial and anti-immigrant efforts. I was just reading a piece this morning about the rise of a new wave of xenophobia in South Africa towards migrants from other parts of the continent, enables a populist authoritarianism and militates against these kinds of values. I think that that's another one of these long-term projects where trans-societal linkages will be really, really important. That the kinds of things that places like the Coady Institute does, but in terms of building these relationships, ensuring that we have a dialogue about what these values can and should mean. I think most of the evidence shows from public opinion polling that most Africans want to see advances in terms of democracy and human rights. What they don't see is, in many cases, the so-called democracies that govern them delivering those benefits. And so it is something that needs to be approached very carefully in a sovereignty-bound international system. But nevertheless, we can maintain these dialogues in part through this international policy ecosystem that I say we need to reconstitute, to create dialogue for us to understand what democracy and human rights means in context and how we can continue to support those objectives. I'm sorry if that's a bit wandering, but that's attempt to get answers.
Any questions online, Brian?
Yes, there's two. Along the same vein of what we're discussing here, how much is Africa going to be involved in reshaping this in collaboration idea? My feeling is no matter how much inventing is going on, as long as Africa is not genuinely involved, skepticism will remain highly comment. And what is your take on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great question. Everybody has, not everybody, but most people have embraced the rhetoric of African-led development, of country-led development, of an approach to development issues and other foreign policy issues that is based on Africans setting their own priorities. But insofar as this is an inequitable relationship in terms of material resources, there will continue to be a kind of power imbalance. I think one element of the Africa strategy, in the Canadian case specifically, is at least a greater measure of humility than we've seen in the past. The reality is that Canada needs Africa more than Africa needs Canada. And I think there is, at least amongst some of the architects of that policy and some foreign policy makers, a recognition of that dynamic and a recognition that we need to engage in a more genuinely reciprocal way than we have done in the past. But whether that spills over into other contexts, a lot of this has to do with trends towards collective self-reliance amongst Africans, and things like the regional projects that are emerging. But I do sense from things like the communique from the G20 that there is an impatience with imposed preferences, and there is this reality of alternatives that give African governments and African societies leverage that they haven't had in the past. So that's my response.
The second question, similar, is that considering the global uncertainty, what new opportunity does Canada foresee for African professionals, entrepreneurs, and students within the framework of Canada-Africa relations?
That's another great question. As you all will know, maybe better than me, Canada has been on a bit of a roller coaster in terms of its approach to migration issues. I think that there is a huge need to, first of all, ensure that that our visa process is significantly improved in terms of the capacity for movement and engagement. I think that there are opportunities for collaboration or partnerships in the higher education and professional domains that would be really important to build on. In terms of what the Canadian government thinks about this, honestly, I think this is where we get back to this tendency towards short-termism or immediate returns, that there is less recognition than there needs to be of the potential that is represented by more systematic trans-societal linkages in terms of knowledge and skills. But on the other hand, the robust diaspora communities have become important agents of demonstration effect for why this is something that we should value more than we have done in the past.
Okay, my last, you took my question out of my mouth because you mentioned the term diaspora. When I was thinking of inviting David, I was reminded of, I met David, I don't know whether you remember this or not, through a mutual friend, our late friend, Kenneth Bush, who was my mentor and my friend and my teacher. And I clearly remember meeting you through him. And one of the areas Ken really focused on was diaspora in the context of peace building. We all deal with this, Ken. But let me press you on diaspora issues. We understand diaspora is not a uniform community. It has its own diversity and complexity. But in terms of influencing policy within here in Canada, what would be your suggestion? What would be your advice to different diaspora communities, particularly from the African continent, how they should approach it, what kind of the relationship they should build with that done?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I had Gaffey. I confess that I'd forgotten the connection to Ken, and like you, his loss was a huge loss to the international studies and the international development community in Canada. So I thank you for reminding me of that. In terms of how this, interesting, there was an interesting commentary not long ago by there's a Canadian Centre for African Affairs and Policy Research, which is a relatively new and I think quite small outfit, but they were commenting on what may or may not be emerging in relation to the African policy community as a result of their response to the Africa strategy. And one of the challenges for the diasporic community in Canada is to concert their efforts more systematically than has been the case. The African diaspora is large and skilled and knowledgeable, and I see this in the academic domain. I think a lot of the way the landscape has changed in Canadian policy terms has to do with the fact that there are now a really strong group of, to me, young African scholars who are already increasingly impactful in the Canadian both academic and policy domain, but will become increasingly so. And the challenge is to as much as possible think about find points of agreement, find points of prioritization that they can collectively advocate on behalf of. As you have alluded to, diasporas are very, very complex phenomena. They're often deeply divided within diasporic communities, but there needs to be as much consultation as possible amongst diaspora groups on things that they can agree on as priorities that they would like to insist on, and then they need to think about mutuality and reciprocity, and so it has to be this advocacy has to stress the degree to which there are important opportunities for Canada in deepening this relationship, just as there are for Africa. So it's a great question, and I think one of the things that the strategy promised was some sort of ongoing mechanism as a point of contact between the government and the diaspora, and how that unfolds and what is put in place will become a really important potential instrument if it's done in a way that allows for true access and true responsiveness from policymakers.
Thank you, David. Any question from here? Yes.
I think you said Canada needs Africa more than Africa needs Canada. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, look, Canadians, Canadians got used to thinking of themselves as having a kind of, and it's hard to remember this, but as having kind of a special relationship because of some of the activities that we had been deeply invested in, and which we tended to mythologize, right? That Canada's involvement in the end of apartheid was significant, but not nearly as significant as we've tended to portray it as. While we were taking our kind of sabbatical from deep engagement with African issues, a whole bunch of other countries and partners have been aggressively pursuing linkages in Africa, and these are not just the obvious suspects like China and Russia, but also the Gulf states, Korea, Turkey, Brazil. There are many countries that offer much of what Canada would have to offer that are now seeking to forge relationships and have been actively doing so while we were much less engaged over the last generation, really. We first of all need to be clear about what it is that we can offer to African partners that is distinctive and that adds value to the kind of cacophony of partners that Africans are now dealing with. But we also need to recognize that if we want to gain better market access, better economic opportunities, build those kinds of transsocietal skills-based links, but also have the participation and support of African governments for important international policy issues, that we need to invest some real time and some sustained attention to those relationships, and that from an African point of view, frankly, we're not that important, and they can take it or leave it. There were some really bad things that happened in the course of some of the restructuring that went on. We had a very deep relationship with the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, and in a very disrespectful way, the Canadian government simply cut that off in a period of months, which created huge challenges for the Kofi Annan Center, which it's overcome and has diversified its partners. But those kinds of things don't get forgotten quickly, and so we are we are playing catch up, and that's what I mean by. But we need those partnerships to be able to diversify, to gain allies in terms of international diplomacy, and to participate in one of the principal sites of opportunity of the future.
I know, David, you have another engagement, but I will take one last question.
Hi, my name is Nelly. I'm Kenyan. So I will defend my president of each with the Macaron thing. When you are like me, single, no man is approaching me. But if a certain man approaches me and he has like his default, people are like, don't marry that guy, he's default. So what I'm saying, there's always a gap. For example, in African nations where nobody talks to you, no president comes to visit you, but the people who visit you, there's always a catch. China is cheating, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's something the world should embrace, because if you don't talk to me and then he talks to me, what's the issue? So for me, I think no matter what happened between France and West Africa, Kenya is a sovereign country and can welcome anybody. And if it was Mark Carney, I will be very happy if he visited Nairobi. He didn't come, Macron came. So I think that's something that we need the world to see, that we are independent and we can make our own choices. Whoever visits us, we cannot shut away people. We have to wait and see what are they bringing to the table. So my take on that is neutral. It's not good, it's not bad. He came at least with flowers. So my question is, what are the kind of systems that Canada has with Africa to make sure that if there is, let's say, educational sponsorship that reaches the people? I was very, very fortunate. I am here because I am educated. If I didn't go to school, I would already be in Canada. So what are the kind of systems, collaboration that Canada has with Africa that the aid, and especially educational aid, reaches people? Not, sometimes Western people, they send help to Kenya and it just stays at the government level. What are those kind of systems or maybe non-governmental organizations that are already established in Canada that are really helping the people on the ground? When I'm eating, I'm like, I know this came from Canada. So those are the kind of questions that I ask. The other last question, it's about immigration. I'm still new in Canada. This is my bad year. But sometimes I feel as an African, our process is kind of longer than other nations maybe gone to Africa. And then sometimes you find question in the express entry, who do you know in Africa? I'm the first person from my family, so who do I bring up in Canada? So those are the kind of questions that maybe it can bring a new debate on the kind of questioning. I am the first in my family in Canada. So I don't have siblings, I don't have a sister, I don't have a husband. So those are the kind of things, maybe if I was from America, you already asked me that. So those are the kind of relationship, as you said, we want that I'm not coming here to be a burden, but I'm coming here as a partner, you can do that. So those are the relationships that will really make it seem equally, like it's not colonial. So when I sit with you, I feel, oh, okay, I'm contributing something. So that's my observation, and yeah, thank you.
So great observations. In terms of, well, let me start with the second question. I think there's been some very interesting research that has been is approaching a close, essentially studying the experience of people who have partnered with African institutions, with African organizations, in terms of their experience in terms of doing their work as a result of the long delays in the visa process, the lack of transparency, the lack of responsiveness, and really it's hard to get around the reality that there is a double standard, obviously, that the experience of Africans, in part because of the lack of resources that the Canadian Immigration Service has put in place, part because of demand, in part because of racial attitudes, deeply embedded racial attitudes, this is a more difficult journey for Africans than it is for people from many other parts of the world. And I think that is, to go back to Degafi's earlier point, this is something that diaspora groups presumably could all agree on as something that should be changed, but also that the African policy community is already actively lobbying on, but could be doing much more of. Addressing these kinds of issues would go a long way to being a gesture of genuine engagement or genuine partnership with African citizens. So that's something that I think Canadian officials should be responsive to. So it's a huge challenge, but it's one where, because of this new opening, it might be possible to get some leverage on. Your first question was about there was a few different elements there. I take your point that one of the things that is changing is that there are a panoply of potential partners. There's a large range of potential partners, and all of them will have something to offer. And you want to find out, you as a sovereign nation, as a self-determining community. You want to be able to look for the best available opportunities. And again, that goes back to my point earlier that we're in a very competitive landscape in terms of Canadian policy, and we need to think about what our comparative advantage is. In terms of educational bridges, Canada used to put a lot of resources into enabling, especially graduate education for African students in the early days of CEDA to come and study in Canada, and in many cases, not all, but in many cases, then bring those skills back to the continent. And we stopped doing that, and I don't know what the whole backstory is. We've spent much more time investing in basic education in terms of development cooperation in the recent past. I know, speaking for myself, my greatest teachers about Africa were fellow graduate students who'd come from the continent, who taught me about their countries and their stories. So I think that we need to do more to build bridges at the level of post-secondary education than we have done in the past. There is a new initiative that I know about, a Canada-South Africa research collaboration that has just been put in place, co-funded by the National Research Foundation in South Africa and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. But it's relatively small scale, and it doesn't do what you're talking about, which is creating opportunities for study and exchange. I think that's the other part. We have lots of African students who want to come to Canada, and we've had many of them here at Dalhousie, but there are sometimes fewer opportunities for Canadian students to go and study in and learn about Africa, and I think we need to do more. We're getting a bunch of Brazilian students in my classrooms now, because the Brazilian government and the Canadian government agreed to put some money into opportunities for educational exchanges, and I think we would do well to pursue a similar kind of model in relation to African countries.
Thank you so very much, David. As I said earlier, what you have provided us is really a very comprehensive framework and comprehensive reflection, because during the periods of turmoil which we're living in, one of the challenges really having well thought and well formulated compass or understanding to really inform and educate ourselves. And that has been a challenge over the last number of years because of the fluidity, because of the ongoing things, and sometimes we don't even know what is happening in the future. I think what you have provided us is a very precise path for us to think and put historical context as well, that where we have been and why we are here. So all those kind of things really, given the fact that as institute, Coady, our primary and substantial work is in Africa. So knowing that background and reality is very important. I think we are enriched by your presence, and I hope and continue to work on more engagement and more collaboration between you and Coady Institute, and particularly in the areas of development and peace and all those kind of issues. I look forward to engaging in that direction. For today, I think you have been very generous with your time, and I'm grateful for every word and every moment you spent with us. And next time when you completely healed, I would love to have you here in person and have the Ethiopian coffee with us. For that.
I have to say, thank you so much, Degafi. I have to say, Eileen's comments about the smell of Ethiopian coffee was making me very, very jealous. And I will make sure that the next time I'm able to be with you in person. I really appreciate this opportunity. There's so many knowledgeable people in your network, and I think we really we at Dalhousie and we in Halifax would benefit from much more systematic engagement with you than we've had in the past. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And if you or anybody else has any follow-up questions that they'd like to send my way, then please feel free to do so.
Thank you, David. I'll be in touch.
Okay, take care.
Yep.